How's it going today? In today's video, I wanted to follow up on my video from yesterday where I covered how to forgive yourself when you're at your lowest point. And if you want to watch that video, you can catch it right above me here. But today's video, I want to talk about how depression changes us. And I want to talk about this for two reasons. One is for our own sake, for us, the people who are depressed, for the ones that are struggling, what this means and what this process is like and how we can get back to ourselves and how we can address the depression knowing that we are really a different person when we are depressed. It's important to understand that when you're depressed so that you can act differently, so you can help yourself get out of it. But also for the people who don't understand depression, I want to address that. I'm going to address that at the end because I think a lot of people don't understand that when someone is depressed, they really aren't the same person. They don't have the same beliefs. They don't have the same motivation. They don't have the same desires. They can't enjoy the things that they typically like. So for someone who's never really experienced depression, it's hard to really grasp that. But I think it's important to acknowledge. And when I say that it changes us, I don't mean it changes our entire personality, but in a sense, it does change how we think. It changes, obviously, how we feel, and it changes how we plan out our lives. It also changes whether or not we can enjoy certain things. And this is kind of baked into the depression. And this is something we have to realize, that all of that lack of motivation and all of that lack of pleasure towards things we usually enjoy, sometimes we will blame ourselves for that. And we will blame ourselves for being unable to motivate ourselves. We'll blame ourselves for being unable to enjoy things that we typically like, unable to socialize the way we usually do, relate to others the way we do. But we have to realize that that is the depression. That is the depression at its core. That is, by definition, what it is. And it robs us of the ability to do things that, when we're feeling good, we kind of take for granted. And I want to tie this in to my video from yesterday because, in my video yesterday, I talked about how when we look back on our life, we often don't realize that the times we made bad decisions were the times when we were at our lowest. We think of ourselves as this static being that doesn't change. So when we look back, we blame ourselves and we get mad at ourselves for making bad decisions. But oftentimes the reality is we make bad decisions when we're not in a good headspace. And when you're not in a good headspace, and let's use the word depression here. If you're in a depressed state of mood, your entire worldview is different. The way you look at yourself, the way you view yourself, the way you view your future, right? If you're depressed, you can't think of a future. So how the hell are you going to plan for a future? How are you going to act today as if you have a future if it doesn't feel like you have a future worth living for? But then what happens is if we get out of the depression, when we look back on it, we get upset with ourselves for the way we acted. And I think that sometimes this is what elongates the depression. We're depressed, we're struggling, and every day we're waking up feeling miserable. And we're getting mad at ourselves for the way we acted yesterday. I said I was going to do X, Y, and Z, and I didn't do it. Why didn't I do it? Well, because you were depressed, which means you didn't have the same motivation. You couldn't think in the way that you want to think, and you certainly can't feel the way you want to feel, right? When you're in a good mood, generally, things are easier, right? You don't really have to push yourself all that much when you're feeling motivated. It comes relatively natural. Now, that doesn't mean you're always going to feel energetic and motivated when you're in a good mood, but it's a hell of a lot easier than when you're depressed. And also, if you're depressed, you're sort of in survival mode, right? You're just trying to make it through the next day. So you're not in a position to, again, think about planning for your future and think about making wise decisions for what you want to do later on, because, again, that's not on the top of your mind. The top of your mind is, how do I get through this miserable experience right now? It's really important that we acknowledge just how much depression changes us when we are depressed, because if we don't acknowledge it, we're going to get trapped into these negative thought cycles that we cannot escape from. Because the reality is, depression is going to cloud all of your thinking. And this is why, traditional therapies like CBT often struggle at combating depression, because you can't really think your way out of a depression. Because anytime you try to think your way out of it, your thoughts are clouded by the depression. So they're all distorted anyway. So even if you try to impart some positive thinking, the depression is just going to take it and twist it into something negative, and you're going to be right back where you started. And if you're not fully aware of how depressed you are, you might not realize exactly what the depression is doing to you. You might just start taking the thoughts at face value, right? If you just start getting some negative thoughts because you're feeling depressed, I'm just lazy, I'm worthless, I'm useless, I don't contribute anything to society. If you take those at face value without realizing how the depression is changing your thought process, well, now you're really going to internalize it and you're going to make it very personal. And then you're going to seep deeper and deeper into a depression because you're going to believe that it's true in a sense. But you have to remember that the only reason you're thinking that way is because of the depression itself. Now, where it gets tricky is what depression will do is it will find things from your past or maybe even your current situation to point to how miserable you are, right? So it'll give you all the evidence. And this is where it gets really hard. And when you're working with someone who's really depressed, or maybe even just talking to a friend who's really depressed, you'll probably find that when you try to talk to them, quote unquote, rationally, and you try to say, hey, but you did this and you did this, and look, you're a really great friend and this and that, they will tell you all the reasons why that's wrong. And they will start to find all the evidence throughout their life of why they were a miserable friend and why they were a miserable worker and they're useless and they're pointless to society because, again, their whole mind is being filtered, is being clouded by the depression, and they can't think the way that they do when they're not depressed. So if you are depressed, it's really important that you acknowledge just how much this can warp your mind. And that way you can see it coming. When you notice that your thoughts are getting very negative, look, you may not be able to change them right away because you're depressed. But at the very least, you can say to yourself, hey, the depression is changing me. Like, this is not how I usually think. I don't typically think like this. Something is going on. I have to be really careful that I don't take this all so personal because this isn't really about me. This is the depression. It's like a leech and it's infected your brain and it's making you do these things. It's making you think differently. It's making you behave differently. And so in that sense, that's what I mean when I say that it changes us, because it really does. If it changes the way we act and the way we think and the way we relate to others, that's what it does. It changes us. And again, when we finally escape it, if we're lucky enough to finally get out of it and start to see the clouds lift and we get in a better mood, it's almost hard to relate to that person again. You go back and think of the ways that you used to think, and you might think like, what the hell was wrong with me? What was going on there? Why was I so negative? Why did I push everyone away? Why was I so angry and irritable? And then if you don't acknowledge again just how impactful the depression is, you might start blaming yourself. You know, what's wrong with me? I'm such a screw up. And then there we go. We just start the depression all over again. So when you get out of the depression, or at least when the mood starts to lift, you have to realize, okay, I have to be very careful not to get into the blame game of what just happened. These last few months that I feel like I just wasted my life, be very careful not to start beating yourself up for the way you acted in those last few months, because that was not who you are. And, you know, this is why it's interesting to me when people will say that they don't want to take medication because they're afraid it'll change their personality. And look, I understand the concerns about taking medication. There certainly are risks of taking medication. There are side effects. That's something you have to consider with your doctor and your psychiatrist. But the interesting thing about that whole situation is people will say, well, yeah, I don't want to take medication. I don't want to change my personality. But the depression is changing your personality. Like, your personality has already been changed by the depression. If anything, the medication is trying to take your personality back. It's trying to bring you back to who you are, because the depression has not allowed you to be who you are. If you're typically a sociable person and you're typically a forward-thinking person and a positive person, and then you just get all of that gets zapped out of you, if the medication can bring some of that back to you, back to your life, why not try it, right? Especially if you've had really treatment-resistant depression, you've been in therapy for a while and it's not really working, why not try it? Why not give it a try? And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be on it forever. Like, it could just be something that helps you for a few months just to get back to where you were. You can start thinking clearly again, really start feeling better. And then you can start to use that momentum. It doesn't always have to be a long-term solution medication. And that's another important point about depression, is that I think we tend to think that depression starts with our thoughts, but oftentimes depression starts with feeling, right? And sometimes people will have depressions where their thoughts aren't even necessarily that negative, or they're not really getting a whole lot of cognitive depressive symptom, negative thinking. They're just so sluggish. They feel low energy. They can't sleep, or they're sleeping way too much. They're in bed 20 hours a day. They're not really thinking a whole lot. They don't have much even going on. That's a real physical depression. And when we have negative thinking, we often assume that the negative thinking is the thoughts, or we think it's because some truth has been revealed to us about who we are. We start to realize how terrible of a person we are. We start to beat ourselves up. We're starting to see patterns in our past and say, yeah, look how shitty I was. But that's all the depression. Because one of the symptoms of depression, by the way, is excess guilt. You have more guilt than you should have. That is a feeling. You'll feel guilty over nothing. You'll just feel guilty just for existing, just for being, in your mind, a nuisance to other people. And then that starts to warp your thinking, and then you start to believe that. So it goes from emotion to thought to belief, not from belief to thought to emotion. And that's a very different way to look at it, because if you think that it starts with belief, again, you're going to take it very personally. You're going to think it's about you. It's not about you. It's the depression making you feel this way and making you believe these terrible things about yourself. Okay, so if you're struggling with depression, just be mindful. When these shifts start to happen, when you notice these shifts, take note and realize that this does not have to do with who you are. These changes are occurring because this is what the depression is doing to you. And be mindful that that person who wasn't depressed, that you used to identify as, that person is still in there, and you can always re-find that person. And then finally, I just want to say to the people who have not really dealt with depression to really understand this, that people who are going through depression, obviously, first of all, it's not their fault. They're not trying to do this. Who would want to be miserable? It makes no sense to blame someone for being depressed. But two, you might find that when you talk to them, they sound like a different person. That's because, again, in a sense, they are. Everything about them is changing, and as hard as they want to try to be positive, they just can't do it. Their brain will not allow them. They don't have the positive emotion to allow them to think positively. And that's where that disconnect is occurring. So just understand and be a little bit more empathetic to your friends who are struggling with depression, that this is a very powerful internal shift that they can't just change by taking on a new perspective. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like and subscribe and comment below on your experience of what your depression has been like, what has helped you, what hasn't helped you. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.